Hi there, Phil Goldberg here, live from Los Angeles in my highly cluttered office. You can't see that, but it is. And we're here for the third of four Facebook Lives about Paramahansa Yogananda and the life of Yogananda, my new biography of him, which you can see in the background. And the book will actually be published officially 1 week from today. This is the 17th of April, and the book official publication date is the 24th. But you can pre-order it online at Amazon and the other usual suspects. And if you do, there's a free gift that I created as a kind of incentive for pre-ordering. It is a 20-minute audio about the essential I call it life lessons from the life of Yogananda. There is a great deal to learn when you study the life of such a person, and the audio is sort of designed to call attention to certain things we can internalize to improve our own lives as we read the book and sort of read between the lines. So you can find out about that on my website, philipgoldberg.com. And you can also, I urge you to look at my calendar and my upcoming public events. I'm going to be doing a lot of traveling on behalf of the book in May and June and July. So I hope you'll come by where I'm speaking and say hello, introduce yourselves, ask difficult questions, and otherwise participate in this launch. And I should say, I look forward to you introducing yourselves here at this Facebook Live and asking questions. I will try to remember to look at the screen and see if you have any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them as we go along. In the first two episodes of this four-part mini-series, we sort of sketched out much of Yogananda's life prior to his coming to America in 1920. And as many of you know, and as you'll see in reading the book, Yogananda's guru, Sri Yukteswar, there's a lot in the book about their relationship, and I highly recommend reading those sections because you learn a lot about the life of a spiritual seeker and the guru-disciple relationship. But his guru was told early on by his own guru, Lahiri Mahasya, that he would one day have a disciple that he could groom and prepare to be the emissary of their lineage, of Kriya Yoga lineage, and bring it to the West. Sri Yukteswar recognized that Yogananda was that anointed disciple very early on and told him so. And as a result, Yogananda knew, well, he knew even before that, because Lahiri Mahasya had told Yogananda's parents that he had such a destiny. And so he knew that when he became a Swami and when he began his work in the world, which, as I mentioned last time, was destined not to be one of seclusion like many renunciates, or called in India sannyasis, live, but one of activity and engagement in the world with a mission that Yogananda took very seriously as his life's work, even though there were times when he would rather have been a typical sannyasi living in a cave in the Himalayas. But he knew that was his destiny, and the first thing he did after becoming a Swami, the first engaged work he did was to create a school, which had gotten off to a rather extraordinarily good start, given that Yogananda and his fellow Swamis who created the school were in their early and mid-20s at the time. But at a certain point, and I dramatize this in the book, you'll find it entertaining, I'm sure, he got the inner signal that the time had come to go to America. And how that came about and the subsequent steps that had to fall into place for him to actually get here. And by here, I mean quite literally, to end up in Los Angeles, from Calcutta in 1920, when there were not that many ships, passenger ships, making that voyage. In fact, he ended up on the very first passenger ship from India to America after the war, because all travel had been suspended during World War I. And so all these things that came about, how he got his passport in time, how he booked the ticket, how he got the money to make the voyage, how uncannily things fell into place so that he actually had a destination and people waiting for him to participate in what was then called the Congress of Religious Liberals in Boston, where he became a replacement for the only Indian who was to be at that Congress. All that makes for my side wonderful research and great fun to write about, and I'm sure you'll find it interesting and entertaining when you read the book. But he came to America, and he would spend of his remaining 32 years of life, he would spend all but 18 months of it here in America, with a couple of short side trips to Mexico. So he was here during the Roaring '20s, during the Great Depression years of the '30s, the buildup to the Second World War and the rise of fascism, the war itself, the war years, and then the 7 years following the war as America was rebuilding, and that sort of post-war boom during which he published his famous autobiography of a yogi. And so these were eventful and fascinating years in history. And it was very exciting to explore the impact of those historic events and the social and economic and political circumstances that he lived through, and how it affected him and his work, what he said about those phenomena, all of which is in the book. And of course, we don't have the time to go into it here. But those years, those essentially 3 decades, constitute the most significant portions of Yogananda's life, in the sense of those were the years that he did the work and created the books and gave the lectures and created teaching materials and gathered the disciples and followers and students, and did all the things necessary, acquire properties and headquarters and all that, that would stand the test of time and are still representing his legacy in the world, which continues to have a big impact on all of us and on yogis and spiritual seekers of all persuasions, even to this day. So I devote actually 2/3 of the book, approximately, to his life after he comes to the West from India. Whereas in his autobiography of a yogi, less than 10% is devoted to those 30 plus years. And so that was part of my rationale for writing the book, that there was much left out about this sort of key adult years of his life, and that I set out to fill the gaps. And those years can be divided roughly into two parts: 1920 to 1935, when he goes to India and tours Europe on the way, and then the latter part of 1936 until his passing in 1952. Those periods have different characters, and so it was very thoughtful of him to live his life that way, because we have this Facebook Live and next week's Facebook Live, and we can cover each of those two periods in each session. I have been asked to show some pictures from the book. There's a beautiful, several pages of beautifully done black and white images in the book. And I'm very thankful to the Hay House staff, the designers, for creating such a beautiful centerpiece for the book, and to illustrate certain things that are described and mentioned in the book. And I'm also grateful to certain people who gave me the rights to use photographs. Some of them are my own, and I'm astonished at how good they look. I took some pictures in India with my iPhone, and they're rendered here in glossy black and white. Makes me look like a good photographer. And also to Self-Realization Fellowship, especially, because they gave us permission to use about 15 photographs that they own the rights to. So I'm going to show you just one page. Let's see if I can get this right. This page here, let's see if I can angle it right. It's a mirror effect. You see, I'm going to talk about some of this stuff today and next week, but you see the one on top where it says American Women Victims of Hindu Mysticism, with a picture of a young woman bowing at the foot of a Swami. That appeared in the Washington Post in 1912 during a period of a mild hysteria over fears that American women were becoming gullible victims of the swamis and yoga masters who were here, and men and Christian preachers who didn't want these women to be hypnotized by the inscrutable dark-skinned Orientals who would invade their brains and make them do unspeakable things. This was part of American history, folks, and Yogananda stepped into that in 1920, probably not even knowing it existed, but he became, in certain ways, a victim of some scandalous sort of rumors and headlines in the early days of what we now call fake news. Next to that, where you see Free Lecture by Swami Yogananda, August, whatever it is, that is him standing next to a poster for a lecture he gave in Denver on the cross-country tour he took in 1924. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just thought you should see the photo because, for one thing, I'm going to mention, he took to wearing Western clothing as opposed to the traditional Swami robes when he was out in public and not teaching. When he taught, and when he met with people as in his role as a guru or teacher, he always wore the traditional robes. And typically his hair would be loose, his hair was shoulder length, but he wore it up. And here he's wearing a turban. There are other pictures of him in a sort of fedora, Western style hat. He wore overcoats a lot because it was as close to wearing robes as he could find, but he also wore business suits and Western style pants and shoes to avoid standing out too much in public. And below that, you see, if I can, here, Philharmonic Auditorium, free public lecture, Swami Yogananda, January 13th. This was his debut lecture in Los Angeles, and that was a major historical event, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And next to that is the cover of the very first East-West magazine, which became the sort of house organ for his organization, which originally was called Yoga Sangha and then became Self-Realization Fellowship, and the magazine came to be called Self-Realization. It had other names as well, but that's the very first issue, and in it you can see what was the sort of Yogoda symbol, the logo. And you can read about that and see it in the book. Those are some of the many beautiful pictures. I'll show more next time. So here Yogananda came in 1920. He arrived in Boston for that Congress. In September of that year. And one of the things I always found interesting to speculate about was he must have really liked the early autumn weather in New England. But as many of you know, by late October, November, and then further into the winter, things would get really, really cold. And India is not like that. So he was enduring, hey, I remember moving to Boston from New York and finding it really difficult to adapt to winter there. So you can imagine somebody coming from the heat of India in Calcutta at Christmas time, it's probably 70 degrees, and not so in Boston. So I always wondered about that. But he had other things to adapt to. I mean, he came to speak at this Congress, and he was there with other spiritual leaders and religious clerics and so forth, but, you know, as the only Hindu, essentially. And I found it fascinating to learn about, write about, and speculate about how he adapted. In addition to the weather, he had to adapt to other aspects of daily life that are, even in 1920, were very different here than in India. There was the next day's Boston Globe had a full-length picture of him. A photographer had come to the harbor to greet the ship, and there were pictures of some of the passengers, and especially him because he stood out so much. And you'll see in it, he's clean shaven. Well, it turns out that his passport picture has him wearing a beard, and that he had a beard when he boarded the ship in Calcutta. He had the beard, long hair of a typical Indian sannyasi, a Swami. But he was clean shaven when he arrived, and it turns out that some of the Americans on board the ship advised him that fitting in, looking as he did, might be difficult, and that he might suffer even abuse and that he might be accepted more readily if he shaved and cut his hair. But he did shave, but he did not cut his hair, because that would have been a real violation of the custom of living a life as a Swami. And as you know, if you've seen pictures of him throughout his life, he remained clean shaven the rest of his life, but the hair was always long, as you can see on the cover of his famous autobiography and in other pictures. However, when he was out in public, as you saw in that picture I showed, he would wear Western clothing, and unless he was teaching. And he would either pull his hair back and tuck it under his collar in the back so it looked like he had a haircut, or he would pull it up and wear a hat, either a turban if he wanted to wear traditional clothing, or sometimes, a Western style hat that most, American men wore in that time. And, he was a stranger in a strange land, and he was treated. There were always two kinds of Americans. There still are today. Americans who welcome strangers and immigrants and find them interesting and treat them with respect and dignity, and others who are threatened by people with different skin color, people from different cultures, different religions, different parts of the world. And here he was, filling a lot of stereotypes of India in those days, of Hinduism, of Orientals as they were known. And, he couldn't change the color of his skin no matter what he wore. And so, some of it was humorous, but he was also taunted and teased and stared at, mocked when he was out in public. And he was exposed to the racism of the era, not only racism because of his dark skin, but also religious bigotry, because he would have been thought of as a heathen by many Christians who were closed to the harmony of religions that he would have preached and the commonality of religious experience that he taught. And so, he endured a lot. And the peak of that in this first part of his life came in 1928, when he was in Miami, which was not yet the sophisticated city it is now. It was essentially part of the Deep South. Well, it still is in certain ways, but he ran into a tremendous amount of bigotry there. And part of it was what I mentioned earlier, this fear of white Christian men that dark-skinned mystics like him could take advantage of women. And most of the students who would come to him, hear his lectures, take his classes, they were large part women, majority in most cases, like the yoga world is today. They had the free time and they had the interest and the curiosity more than the men did, and were more open-minded, you could say. But given the sort of spirit of the era, the husbands and the older brothers did not like their wives and sisters and their sweethearts exposed to these heathen teachings and the possible seductive nature of the men. So he suffered under that, and in Miami was essentially forced to leave town and cancel his classes because of the irate husbands and the Miami officials, some of whom were very hostile to him, others were very friendly and warned him for his own safety's sake to leave town. And that it got a lot of newspaper coverage. And he fought it. He didn't want to leave. He didn't want to give in to that bigotry, but he eventually did. And he called it his Miami crucifixion. So those episodes are described in my book, but also the sort of humorous part of adapting to a new culture and a new way of life. He said that when he saw signs for hot dogs, he thought, what kind of crazy country am I in here where they eat the flesh of dogs? And there's a great description of his first restaurant experience was he spent the first night he was here, first couple of nights, in the YMCA in Boston. Didn't know anybody or anything yet. And when he went down to the restaurant in the building to eat, he sat at a table waiting to be served until he realized by watching that it was what we call a self-service cafeteria, which he'd never seen before. And he had to learn how to deal with that, and the water fountains and other interesting things. He was directed to ladies' room because people saw the long hair and that kind of thing. But the more serious kind of adaptation he had to make was in his teaching. And, he was bringing traditional yogic wisdom to a new land. His English was good. He was very insecure about it, but it turned out he was a much better speaker of English and a much more skillful public speaker than he realized, because he had anxiety about that. He expressed it to his guru before he left India. I don't know English well. I don't give public lectures in English. How am I going to do it? But he did, and he rose to the occasion and turned out to be awfully good at it, and learned the proper ways of communicating. There's a term in Sanskrit called upaya. It essentially means skillful means, skillful methods. Gurus are implored to develop upaya, the skillful means of transmitting knowledge to their students and devotees. And he certainly had that. He had that gift, and he had, because he had to adapt what he focused on, the themes he spoke about, the language he used, and the delivery systems. He was prevailed upon fairly early to adopt American methods to attract more people than, the handful who would come to someone's living room to hear him speak. As he expanded and as he got followers who were savvy, they would say, well, we need to rent halls, we need to advertise. These are things that were not, he didn't think had to be done, but he adapted. And he had followers who would put up some money to do these things. And he had to charge a fee for his classes. And he adopted, on good advice early on, the strategy of giving free public lectures to large numbers of people, and then holding classes where he taught various methods and deeper knowledge, and to charge a fee for those classes as opposed to just relying on donations. And that was a departure from the traditional ways. And he would make many more of those, most especially things like holding what he called services, what in India would be called a satsang, a gathering of fellow devotees, on Sunday mornings, and to set them up so they resembled a church with proper seating and a podium and that sort of thing, because that Americans got religious on Sunday mornings, and people who attracted to his teachings might like to keep up that habit, and he wanted it to be comfortable for them and familiar. And he actually called some of his facilities, as they developed, churches. They were called Church of All Religions. And so that was a form of adaptation that traditionalists in the Hindu fold would not have necessarily approved of, but that were obviously turned out to be essential to his being able to fulfill his mission of reaching large numbers of people. And it should be said that, it's not like he stepped into a vacuum. There were swamis who preceded him. There were some swamis who lived in major cities of America. There were yogis who came to teach hatha yoga practices. And the swamis were, traditional orange robe Indians who were trained in the lineage of Yogananda's great predecessor, Swami Vivekananda, who had come here in 1893 and spent only a few years. But his lineage would train swamis in India to teach throughout India, but some of them were trained to come to America. And so he had predecessors like those and contemporaries, and also the foundation that was laid by by the transcendentalists, mainly Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, who adapted yogic Indian spiritual teachings into their own work and their books and so forth, and what was called the New Thought movement, started by people like Madame Blavatsky and others, that also sort of combined Western metaphysics with the teachings that we think of as Hindu and Buddhist. And so there were those people who were drawn to the East, drawn to New Thought, who had read Emerson, who had visited one of the other swamis, and they were the natural target audience for Yogananda's first set of students, and they turned out in large numbers as he became better known, and as I said earlier, started attracting thousands of people, many of whom became students of his. And there were also, it should be said, people who didn't think of themselves as spiritual, certainly not religious, but who were secular people, maybe even atheists, who wanted to improve their lives. Americans have this ethos of self-improvement. We always want to better ourselves. We want more. We want more of this, more of that. And in some cases, the aspiration for more wealth, a better career, a good marriage, and all these things people aspire to that we assume, often erroneously, that will make us happy. Some people realize that improving themselves from within will help them live a happier, more fulfilling life. And so the ethos of self-improvement and self-help had arose in America as a major phenomenon, and that was prominent even in the 1920s. It's a big part of the sort of spirit of the Roaring Twenties. And so people might come and learn yogic methods of meditation and the physical practices Yogananda developed to improve their bodies, improve their minds, improve their inner stability. And many of them had no interest in metaphysics or spirituality. But then when they heard Yogananda's message, as it was the case with many other gurus, they realized there's more to life than just the typical forms of self-improvement, and they might step on the spiritual path. So Yogananda learned to adapt to this. His very first lecture when he came to America at that Congress was called The Science of Religion. And that was a description of the yogic way of cultivating and developing inner religious experience, spiritual growth and development in a scientific way that he would describe as psychophysiological methodologies of yoga, mainly meditation practice. But he added to his repertoire sort of a whole bunch of self-improvement titles. It was fascinating to go through the newspaper ads, first in Boston, then New York, and then other parts of the country as he toured, to see what his lecture topics were. And you could see some of them were, classic sort of Indian philosophy and metaphysics, but others were self-improvement, sort of, how to have a better career, how to find your soulmate, how to improve your health. And he learned that that's what bulk of Americans' initial sort of motivation would be, to just sort of improve their lives on a daily basis. And then that would get them in the door. That would be the entry point. And then he would tell them, there's a lot more to life than those topics alone would suggest. In any event, so after sort of stabilizing his work in India and calling on a colleague from India, a fellow Swami, to go to Boston and hold down the fort, and more about that next time. He took off and had triumphant appearances in New York and Philadelphia, and then eventually had this wonderful cross-country trip by automobile in a Maxwell Roadster with a fellow Indian, a Muslim he'd met on board ship, who became a kind of assistant and secretary, and who seemed to have very good organizing and advertising skills. And at a certain point in their trip, ran on ahead to the cities they were coming up to and organized lectures that Yogananda would give, and set aside dates for classes and so forth. So beginning in Denver, and then Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, he had successful teaching ventures, which brought to the fold students some of whom would later become close disciples, or at the very least people who would organize gatherings in their hometown, maybe acquire office space or a center. And that's how his movement was built. But his destination all along ultimately was Los Angeles. Somehow he knew that LA, maybe LA even then, well, it did. I write about this in the book, that it even then had a destination of a place where people could go. The reputation as a place where people could go to sort of reinvent themselves, where new fads would develop, and some of which would become permanent features of the culture. A creative place, a place with very congenial weather, especially if you were Indian. LA's weather is more like Calcutta than most places in the U.S. And where a sort of new creative spiritual teachings developed, just as creative movie making developed. And that became his home. And he arrived here on January 2nd, 1925. And the picture I showed you earlier of that LA Philharmonic advertisement, that was for the very first lecture he gave. And LA Philharmonic Auditorium held about 3,000 people. And the Los Angeles Times write-up of the first lecture indicated, well, it said that about twice that many people actually showed up to hear him speak, and half of them, had to be turned away. But that was the first in a series, and out of that came, some very important followers. And within months, he had determined that LA, which he called the Benares of America. If you know anything about India, you know that Benares, what's now called Varanasi, is sort of the holiest city in India, and probably the oldest contiguous place of residence on the planet. And he felt that LA might have something resembling the sort of holiness of sacred Benares, and determined that this would be the place he would plant his feet as in America. And he did. And within months, they acquired a property up on a hilltop called Mount Washington, which overlooks downtown LA. It was an old resort, an upscale resort that had fallen on tough times and was up for sale. And some of his prominent followers gathered the money and did all the paperwork, and they acquired the property, fixed it up, and that became a place of residence for a small number of people, and the international headquarters, and it remains so to this day. They call it the Mother Center, and eventually it became the headquarters of the entire international operation, including India, that Yogananda would establish over the next decades. And it remains, it'll be the 100th anniversary in just a few years, in 7 years of that. It's kind of remarkable. I always say that Yogananda had the best real estate karma of any guru who ever came to America. And that was the first of the properties he acquired. He had actually seen it in a dream, he said, and back in India, in a vision. And when he saw the land and he saw the building, he said, this is the place. And they managed to get it. And how that happened, and all the mechanisms and the doings made for some fun storytellings. But he didn't stay here long. He, in fact, he did not see a Christmas in Los Angeles for 4 years. And he loved Christmas, and he would love to have been here with, a place that had become his home with the people students he was closest to, and handful of which, or a dozen or so, moved in. But he couldn't have Christmas here because he was just busy traveling. He became quite a road warrior and constantly on the move in the early part of later part of the 20s and early 30s. And this was, necessary for his mission. He was the face of his movement, the only teacher really, until he started, eventually training others to represent his teachings and be able to impart them to others. And so he traveled by road, sometimes by automobile, throughout the country, and his itinerary was exhausting. I was lucky. Some of his devotees and people interested in his life had constructed timelines of where he was on which dates, and I was able to reconstruct that in a narrative form to some degree, and do research on the newspapers of those places he went to and see what was going on and how he was advertised. And the next several years were devoted to those kinds of travels and sort of being a Johnny Appleseed for yoga and in bringing these teachings into the world, into the Western world, and planting places that would take hold and sprout other followers and become permanent places where his teachings were represented. And he would come back to LA for visits whenever he could, but also because of the acquisition of this property and others, that as time went on, he was under tremendous financial strain right from the beginning. Mortgages had to be paid, bills had to be paid, food had to be purchased, even though the volunteers were doing most of the work and people who were happy to live in Mount Washington for, room and board. Things had to be paid for, and so finances became a major burden to him. And of course, just the administrative hassles of running an organization and dealing with human beings who are less than perfect, as we all are, the dynamics of that, the dynamics of community, the arising of enemies, people who would like to have seen him fail, people who turned on him. All this was a big part of his life. People who felt disappointed by him, and he had to endure lawsuits, some of which were front page news in LA and some of which spread, and there were, scurrilous rumors about him and, accusations of wrongdoing, especially around women. All of this was a big part of what he had to endure in America and why he was so tempted to leave on a number of occasions. But he persevered. He had a mission that his guru lineage had given to him, and he took it quite seriously. And that persistence in the face of challenges and opposition is something you don't necessarily associate with yogis, especially, renunciate swamis who essentially renounce worldly interests and things like money. But he had to, and he endured. And that's part of the lessons I talk about in that free audio gift that we can all learn from his life. But there were also blessings, of course. I emphasize the difficulties because we don't expect that in the life of a yogi necessarily. But he had to face up to it, just like other people with ambitious agendas and missions always have to. And he continued to adapt his teachings, continue to adapt the way of life, continue to adapt the policies of organizational life, and so forth. And the blessings included some wonderful human beings, Americans who stepped up to the plate, who became devoted to him, loyal students, loyal disciples, loyal friends. And some of them, in particular, Mr. James Lynn, who became his closest friend and closest disciple, and the one he anointed to succeed him as the head of his organization, was a wealthy businessman from Kansas City who was always there for him and wrote big checks, to put it mildly, that saved the day on numerous occasions and allowed for the expansion of his organization, even during the Great Depression, when the economy was in the tank and people couldn't even afford to take his classes, let alone more. And James Lynn was a kind of hero for those who value Yogananda's work and his legacy. And there were others as well. And I should say that a big part of his success was his fondness for and his reverence for Jesus. All gurus have that, had great respect for him. He's seen as a great yogi, a great guru, a great even incarnation of God in India, right up there with, their own pantheon of avatars and saints. But Yogananda took it another level and felt that a part of his mission was not just to bring to the West the true teachings of India, but also what he called original Christianity. His own guru was a great scholar of the New Testament, and he learned from him, and he learned from other sources, and wrote and spoke so much about Jesus that, after his death, his followers eventually put together this 2-volume book called The Second Coming of Christ, which is, organized all of that he had ever said and written about Jesus and the true message of Christianity in over 1,000 pages. So that was another part of his adaptation that some people would take exception to because they were traditional Christians, and what he was teaching would have been thought of as either madness or blasphemy, but which also for many Christians gave them new insights into their own tradition, and in some cases, new fondness, new relationship to their own tradition. Anyway, those are just some of the things I thought to highlight today, but of course there's about 200 pages in my book about his life after he came to America. And we'll pick up on the later years of his life and his return visit to India in 1935 and 6 in our next meeting, which will be noon on April 24th, which just happens to be the official publication date of The Life of Yogananda. So I thank you for joining me. I hope you come back. Share the link with your friends who weren't able to be here. I hope you pre-order the book. I hope you like the book. I hope you send me emails telling me what you like or questions you have. And please go to my website, philipgoldberg.com. Check out the pre-order procedure and also look at my calendar and come to some of the public events I have and introduce yourself as a Hay House Facebook Live listener, viewer. Thank you. Namaste, as they say in India. Hold it. I'm looking for the button. Here it is. Bye.